Hi, my name is Jessica Belici, and what I'll be talking about today is how the values, norms, and beliefs of our chosen culture, the homeless population, affect their community relations and the education of their children. So, the first issue I'm going to talk about is the issue of invisibility. If you have a chance, Google NYC Rescue Mission Social Experiment. It's a really interesting short video about a social experiment that this organization did where they interviewed people who were actually active in homeless organizations, homeless assistance, but outside of their office, they planted relatives of this interviewee posing as homeless people. And what they found was that almost every single interviewee walked right past their relatives, didn't recognize these people in their lives when they're dressed and posing as homeless, which just adds another layer and shows how invisible this population really is. How that affects education is that stereotypes of homeless from school leaders prevent us from noticing homeless students, and sometimes embarrassment or pride keeps the students and families from reaching out to us. 75% of homeless students aren't living in a shelter, they're living in a doubled up situation, which is where they're living with relatives or perhaps hopping to different relatives' houses, hopping friends' couches. But they do have addresses, they have vehicles. They're still not in a stable home environment, though. And only 15% live in shelters, but those 75% that aren't living in shelters often aren't receiving services because they aren't being noticed. Another issue that affects the education of homeless children is the high truancy rate. The homeless population is very transient in nature, which conflicts with our seat time based education system. Families are forced to move a lot due to evictions, stay limits at shelters where they only have a certain amount of weeks or months that they can stay there and then they have to move on. The truancy of these children often isn't a case of disengagement or falling into the wrong path, but more practical things like no money for the bus, no ride, they have to help their parents move, they have to watch young children that aren't school aged yet. In a study by the National Center for Homeless Education, all of homeless high school students in the US, only 15% were present for state testing and reading. And that's on the regular testing days and including any makeup testing that they provided. Of that 15%, only 49 were proficient and above for obvious reasons because they're probably missing a lot more school than that 1 or 2 testing days. So they're also not getting a consistent education. Because of that, because of those low grades, 75% of all homeless youth drop out by the grade 11. Our own county office estimated that a child loses between 4 to 6 months of academic achievement every time their family moves, and homeless populations are looking at probably 4 to 6 moves a year if they're chronically homeless. So add that up, and it's a lot of time and a lot of education that kids are losing and falling behind. The last issue I'll talk about is pretty obvious, and just the high level of stress. We know from other studies just about stress in general that it affects the way our brains work, the way that we make pathways. And if you look at a child who's undergoing that much stress, it's actually changing the brain architecture that not only interferes with learning that day or that grade, but over time, over their entire lives. It also affects their emotions, their self-regulating abilities, cognitive skills, their ability to build healthy social relationships. And their parents are also experiencing stress, which has that trickle-down effect. The majority of students in public schools throughout America are actually poor for the first time due to our recession. A lot of the homeless students that we're seeing in schools aren't used to being homeless. Their parents aren't used to being homeless. They're not used to dealing with these kinds of things. They might have had great jobs before. And so that is an extra level of stress that they're now in this situation that they never expected to be in. Schools are actually probably the family's most trusted institution, especially if they're not in a shelter situation where they can turn to other organizations for help. The school might be the front line for that. So it's extremely important for schools to recognize these different issues and offer services to everyone in hopes that they'll reach these invisible kids.